Jeff, are you ready?
I'm ready when you are.
I think the blinking have to stop at the bottom. So just give me about 10 more seconds. The bottom of my screen gonna show when the blinking stops. We can begin. Just
Okay, just
just
let
have.
me know.
All right. I'll do the intro anyway. Don't worry.
Are you going to do the introduction?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Just follow my lead. Okay. Okay. Ready. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Yee Real Estate members and others. Thank you for attending this webinar called Using a Self-Directed IRA and Checkbook LLC, which is Limited Liability Company. My name is Seewing Yee, founder of Yee Real Estate Network. Our mission is to inspire and motivate people to achieve significant wealth for themselves and their families through a time-tested system using a remote, turnkey, passive real estate investment methodology. My special guest today is attorney Jeff Hare, who specializes in helping real estate investors to understand the power of using a self-directed IRA, and more specifically, using a self-directed IRA with a checkbook control, incorporating an LLC. With that in mind, may I introduce to you Mr. Jeff Hare.
Hey, thank you, Seewing. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to make this presentation. One of the best tools that people have discovered for building wealth and for is to purchase real estate. Real estate has always been a wonderful opportunity for people to not only purchase a real item that they will grow in value in most cases, but also creates a cash income through rents, and there's other advantages that can be achieved by building wealth through the purchase of real estate. The problem has been often the case where you can't get enough money to get into the market. Well, right now, of course, we know the market is starting to recover. Prices are still available on properties. The issue comes up is where can you get some money? Many people have money. It's in their IRA, their individual retirement accounts. And many people do not know that you can use that money to actually purchase real estate. So today's presentation is how to do this, how to use your IRA in what we call a self-directed IRA to purchase real estate or to make other investments. And we're also going to discuss the use of what we call the checkbook LLC, which takes the degree of control over your IRA one step further. My name is Jeffrey Hare. I'm a real estate attorney. I've been an attorney working in real estate matters for a little over 25 years. And like anything else, I'm going to move to the next slide. I have to bring up a caveat, and that is that this presentation is for educational purposes only. It's not intended as legal or investment advice. Remember also, self-directed IRAs are not for everyone. We always ask that you consult with a tax, legal, and financial planning professional before you invest your money. Now let's go on to the next slide. Today I'm going to discuss in this overview what is an IRA, what is a self-directed IRA, and what is a checkbook LLC. Let's start with the IRA. As you may have learned if you were able to tune in to Lamar Baxter's presentation on the IRA, it is an individual retirement account. It was established by Congress in 1974, and it was designed and intended to allow individuals to supplement their Social Security income. Next slide. The IRS allows you to use your IRA to invest in both traditional and alternative investments. Generally, you can invest in anything except collectibles, S-corps, and insurance. Next slide. Traditional investments are things you're probably familiar with as common stocks, mutual funds, money market funds, and bonds. Many of you have a 401k or some type of similar investment that is probably invested in one or more of these commodities. Next slide. what we're going to talk about today a little bit is alternative investments. You can invest in private equity, such as purchasing notes and deeds of trust. You can also invest in new business ventures, and the topic that I like the most is investing in real estate. First thing you have to do is you have to determine if you're eligible. You have to have a 401k or 457 or some other form of a IRA plan or a 401k plan that you can roll over. Lamar covered this in great detail in his presentation, and I would suggest that if you can get a copy of that, to go back and review it for some of the more specific information, or to contact his company, and they will help you, of course, to understand whether or not you're eligible to use this IRA. You may be able, in any case, to roll the money from a former employer's 401k plan into a self-directed IRA account. Let's go to the next slide. Now, you have to understand, an IRA is there's two types of IRAs. There's the traditional IRA, which is developed by using what's called pre-tax dollars. In other words, money is taken from your pay and put into an account, deferring the taxes on it until you take a distribution later on, usually after retirement. Then there is the Roth IRA. The Roth IRA was established later on, and it allows you to pay your taxes and then put a certain amount of money into an IRA. The great advantage of the IRA is that once you invest the Roth IRA, it is tax-free. The proceeds from your investments are tax-free for the rest of your life. You are not required to take any minimum distributions, and you can pass those on tax-free to your heirs. There's also another product I'll just mention called the Solo or Single K, and this is a fairly complicated process, but it allows you certain advantages, and is again a form you need to talk with an investment advisor about. The primary advantage of the Solo K is that it doesn't require that you have a custodian, and you can add additional funds to that one over and above what you can add to the other types of IRA investments. Next slide. It is also important to understand that individual retirement accounts, or IRAs, are governed by sets of rules and regulations. I've listed some of them here: IRS Publication 590, and the Internal Revenue Code Section 4975, which is very important because it talks about prohibited transactions. There's also Internal Revenue Code Sections 408 and 408A, and numerous rulings by the Department of Labor, IRS opinions, and tax court decisions. It is important that if you guess wrong at whether these rules or regulations apply, you could find yourself being disallowed for your IRA and end up owing a lot of tax money. So we're going to pay a lot of attention to doing this correctly. Next slide, please. Remember, the rules are to protect your investment. They're to protect the funds in your retirement account. With a self-directed IRA, you take charge. You're the decision maker. But remember, you and your plan, which is what we call the IRA plan, are separate entities. So you as a manager stand apart from your plan. Next slide. Let's look briefly at some of these rules. Basically, these rules tell you what you cannot do with your money. And a good way to think of this is to realize that when you put money into a pension plan or an IRA, it is really not your money yet. It is being set aside as a way of saving it for your retirement. And as long as you don't touch it, as long as you don't do anything with it, it will be deferred from taxes. So it's very important that you keep an arm's length relationship with that money. Remember, the goal is to preserve the special tax treatment and avoid any penalties. Next slide. Now, there are a couple of prohibited transactions I want to highlight here. First, you cannot invest your funds with any disqualified person. That includes yourself. You cannot write a check from your pension plan to yourself, or you cannot do that in any way that results in providing you a direct or indirect personal benefit. You cannot buy, for example, an office building for your business, because you would be deriving a direct benefit from that plan. You cannot use the proceeds of the investment for yourself. Again, you have to wait until the investment is distributed upon attaining a minimum age, usually 59 and a half years old. Next slide. What is a disqualified person besides yourself? Well, you have your spouse, your parents or children, your children's spouses, and your IRA trustee or custodian. It's very simple to keep that in mind, is to visualize a parents or children. In other words, you cannot use the money to buy a condominium for your kid to live in while he's off at college. You also can't buy your mom a house to live in when she's retired. You must keep this arm's length transaction not only from yourself, but from your parents and children and spouses and children of your spouses. Next slide. Let's look at the basic setup of an IRA. First of all, there's you, the account holder. Next slide. Then you have your account, which we call the plan or pension plan. In the next slide, you'll see your investment. This would be a piece of real estate investment property, such as a single-family home, or what's getting very popular these days is investing in multifamily apartment buildings. Next slide. If you look at the relationship in this chart, you have you, your plan, and your investment. You can control your plan and have your plan purchase the investment, but you cannot get involved directly into the investment. Next slide. Let's look at that again. You can interact by directing your plan to make investments, and what these become is your investment is the plan assets of your investment. Next slide. Now, how do you invest with an IRA? Okay, you've got, let's say, a couple $100,000 in a 401k, and you roll it over into a self-directed IRA account. That's step one. Very important that you do that. Without moving the funds into that account, you can't get started here. So that's always going to be step one. Second, identify your investment. Find a real estate investment that you want to purchase. And third, send the funding instructions to your IRA custodian. You tell them, I want to go purchase that property. Next slide. I want to emphasize how important it is to open your account first. The reason is it takes some time to liquidate your money fund assets or other investments and to transfer the funds into your self-directed IRA account. It can take up to a month, although they've gotten much better. Sometimes it can be done in about a week or so. Never put down personal money for a deposit on a real estate investment, hoping to pay the balance with your IRA. So the important thing we emphasize is to make sure the funds should be in the plan account before you invest. Next slide. Now, there are some tax disadvantages of using a self-directed IRA. With a self-directed IRA, you cannot take advantage of tax benefits for depreciation or losses. Why? Because you already are gaining the tax advantage of the deferred taxes granted to you by having your money in an IRA. Remember, always consult with a tax professional. Next slide. One thing that people aren't often aware of is you can use your IRA for leverage purchases. Remember, I use an example. Let's say you rolled $200,000 into your self-directed IRA plan. But the property you want to purchase costs $400,000. You can use your money as a down payment and borrow the balance owed to make the purchase of the property. Now, this requires a special kind of loan called a non-recourse loan. In other words, unlike most purchases, you cannot be a personal guarantor on that loan. That's what non-recourse means in this context. Also, you must be aware that if you were to purchase, let's say, a large apartment complex, and to borrow the money to do that with using your IRA, you may trigger what is known as unrelated business income tax, or UBIT, and these are issues that you need to discuss with your tax consultant. It's not the end of the world. It's just that it isn't 100% tax-free in making that transaction. You will be subject to some taxes. They're relatively minor, but you need to be aware that they're involved. Next slide. The other types of investments you can do with your self-directed IRA. You can do private financing. For example, you can loan money. A lot of people don't want to get involved in investing in real estate because of what we often call toilets, tenants, and trash. In other words, you've got to be a landlord, you've got to deal with issues. Some people don't want to get involved in that. You can loan money, and you can loan money as long as you do not loan it to a person who is a disqualified person. In other words, you cannot loan money to your children or to your parents or to your spouse. You can, however, loan money to other persons, including siblings. The note can either be secured by a deed of trust or not. It's up to you. The payments go directly to your IRA. The terms of the note can be entirely flexible and up to you. So, for example, a lot of private lenders using their IRA can make loans out at 10 or 12%. That's a great return. But remember, those returns come back tax deferred unless they're a Roth, in which case they're tax-free. Next slide. What else can you do with an IRA? Well, I mentioned briefly you can purchase trust deeds and notes. You can also purchase tax liens. You can invest in or purchase businesses. And something that's been fairly popular is you can use an IRA to purchase an option on property or raw land. You can use your IRA to purchase just about anything, including traditional investments such as stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. Next slide. The primary advantages of using a self-directed IRA, remember, proceeds are tax deferred, tax-free if it's a Roth account. You also avoid the need to do a 1031 exchange. If you're familiar with that, that is a process by which you take an investment property and you sell it and purchase another investment property and avoid the capital gains tax by using what is known as a 1031 exchange. That's the section of the Internal Revenue Code that covers this transaction. You don't need to worry about that if you're using your IRA because the funds are already tax deferred or tax free. Another great advantage of using your IRA is there's no reporting. You don't have to, your custodian will report on an annual basis to the IRS, but you don't have to file a lot of the same returns because, again, there's no taxable events taking place until you take your distribution. A major advantage that many people are not aware of is that an IRA or a pension plan is a form of asset protection. Yes, an IRA is a form of asset protection. In other words, it is protected because it's part of the pension plan from attacks by creditors and others. So you may be able to consider that if you purchase a property and hold it in your IRA, that it is protected from attack. Now, you can have many pension plans as you want. You can have several IRAs, for example, each one owning a separate property. And that's a form of asset protection. We're going to talk about asset protection a little bit more when we talk about the CheckBook LLC. Now, I did want to bring a little asterisk into this, and that is, again, if you're using leverage money, if you're using your IRA to purchase a investment property and you have borrowed funds with a non-recourse loan, UBIT may be applied. That's the unrelated business income tax. Next slide, please. Now, there are some disadvantages of using self-directed IRA overall. Again, remember I said, first of all, it's not for everyone. It does require that you pay attention. You have to follow the rules. You must avoid prohibited transactions. And although it sounds easy, sometimes it's very, very tempting if you're caught in a bind to tap the money for improper uses or to loan it to someone like to give that money to your children or your parents. You must resist that urge and make sure you follow those rules, or the IRS will disallow the tax benefits going back to the beginning of the investment. You cannot do cash out refinancing. In other words, you cannot purchase a property with your IRA and then down the road turn around and refinance it to take cash out and do that, because that would be a transaction involving your IRA and yourself. You're not allowed to do that. If I mentioned earlier, you cannot take deductions for depreciation, and if you invest in a project using your IRA and it fails, you cannot deduct the losses. Very, very important to understand that all of the expenses related to your investment must come from the IRA. You cannot put any personal money in to the transaction. You must use the funds in the IRA. And for that reason, you need to plan ahead. You need to make sure there's sufficient funds in your IRA to cover contingency expenses. Next slide. Keep in mind that your retirement plan is the owner of the asset, not you. Okay? So usually what you'll see when you set up one of these accounts, it would be IRA account administrator, whatever company you use, FBO, which means for the benefit of your name, in this case, John Smith, and your account number. It's a mouthful. That's a long thing to write down on a check, but that is how most of these accounts are set up. And remember, when you're directing your custodian, your IRA custodian, to make an investment, they must review all of the documents and approve, and must be signed by them, as well as by yourself. As a result, let's say you're going to purchase a single-family home as an investment rental. When you got all the escrow documents, you must submit all of them to your IRA custodian for them to review, and that sometimes adds 1 or 2 days to the process. And there are certain types of real estate transactions that we're going to talk about here in a minute that require you to have a faster turnaround time. And there's a vehicle that we have to offer you that will help solve this problem. Next slide, please. And that is called the checkbook control. Well, let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk why the checkbook control can provide you some assistance in making sure that your self-directed IRA has even more, that gives you more control over your self-directed IRA. Okay, what is checkbook control? Primarily, what we're trying to do is avoid some of the disadvantages that a traditional self-directed IRA has. One is processing delays. I mentioned one, where if you're trying to close escrow, you have to take all of the escrow documents to your custodian, and they have to review every single one of them. And they may say, well, we need some more paperwork, or we need additional documents, in which case it can take 2 or 3 additional days to close escrow. If you're trying to do an investment in a private placement or in some other form, they must review the private placement memorandum, and they also must process and cut all the checks. And remember, most of these custodians, even very excellent ones, they're usually closed on the weekends, and many of them close early on Fridays. So if you get a transaction and you need to do a hurried transaction, and it's Friday morning and Monday is a holiday, you may not get any return on anything until the following Tuesday. They also charge fees. They're in business. And so for these types of transactions, they also will be charging fees for them. And they've gotten good about charging some more competitive fees, but there still is a cost involved in having the administrator review all the plans. For this reason, the Checkbook LLC is an ideal solution. Next slide. What is an LLC? If you're not familiar with an LLC, let me talk a minute about it. A LLC is known limited liability company. It is a hybrid between what was traditionally a partnership and a corporation. For tax purposes, it is still treated pretty much like a partnership. So, for example, you usually have 2 individuals going together on a real estate transaction as partners. By forming an LLC, they both are they have a share of a membership share of the company based on some percentage. It's usually 50-50, but it can be 60-40 or 80-20, depending on how much money they put into the deal. happens is that in a partnership, each partner is liable for the other partner's debts and obligations. You get a share of the profits, but you also get a share of the losses and of the obligations. So the goal was to find something that would provide some liability protection, and the limited liability company was developed to do that. The members of the LLC are not responsible for the liabilities and obligations of the other members. So that's very important to understand. So a limited liability company, an LLC, is set up like a partnership for tax purposes, but treated as a corporation for liability and asset protection purposes. It is a distinct legal entity. Now, I say it's not a hobby because you really do have to pay attention. When you set up an LLC, you are really starting a business. But you get a lot of benefits by having the LLC, and it stands alone as a separate legal entity. The best part about it, it can have only one member. So even though it's treated as a partnership, LLCs are allowed to have one member, and that one member can be also the manager of the company. Next slide, please. The advantages of an LLC are many. One, it's relatively simple and fast to set up. I can set one up in 24 hours. Normally, the Secretary of State's office can, on a routine processing, takes anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks to process the paperwork, but they have an expediting process that allows it to be set up in 24 hours. The formation and operation of the LLC is less formal than a traditional corporation. There's less paperwork. You don't have to hold formal meetings. And in fact, the operating agreement usually provides that no meetings are required. As I mentioned, you can have one or as many members as you want into an LLC, and it therefore combines the limited liability of a corporation and the flexible management that you usually associate with a partnership. Next slide. Now, what is a checkbook LLC? I've described the limited liability being a separate entity. Think of it as a box that you set off to the side, and you now have this box. We're going to call that the limited liability company. Now, what you do is you are allowed to invest your self-directed IRA into an investment. You can buy real estate directly, or you also can invest that money into an investment such as an LLC. And this could be the LLC that you set up. So let me say that again so you understand that. You can direct that your investment funds, your IRA funds, can be invested into an LLC that you have set up for this purpose. You send the funds to the LLC checking account that you set up, and you are now just the manager of that LLC, but you are not a member. So where's the member? The member is your IRA. And you can have one or more accounts inside that box. The IRA will therefore own the LLC. It'll own the company. And you as the manager can therefore direct where those funds go. Now you can combine anything you want into the LLC. A husband and wife, for example, who are otherwise disqualified can both invest their IRAs into a single LLC and manage it because they are doing that at the same time. That's allowed. Then the LLC can turn around and invest in real estate. Next slide, please. Now, primary advantages of having this checkbook LLC is you can reduce delays by minimizing the processing times that the custodian or the administrator usually takes. Let me give you an example. Let's say you want to purchase foreclosure property at the courthouse steps. You're down there, you're looking through the list, and the deal comes up you've been waiting for, and you want to make a bid, and it's a great deal, and you want $150,000. You've got it. No one else is going to bid on that. You've got it. Well, if your funds are in a traditional self-directed IRA account, you would have to contact the administrator and have them cut a check for you and have it down there right away. and it's almost impossible even for the best of those administrators to do that on short notice. With a checkbook LLC, you can have your cashier's checks from your account already made out and ready to go and close the deal, and that's a very popular way of using the self-directed IRA for doing courthouse purchases. In the traditional process as an investor, as you know, there's a lot of little costs that come up from time to time, such as, water heaters break. Sometimes you get, if you're buying some distressed properties, you get a notice from the city that the weeds need to be mowed, or there's an emergency repair for plumbing. Things come up all the time. Again, if you have to go back to your administrator and have them cut a check to pay for those items, and it's late on Friday, and you may not be able to get a hold of them until next week. Here in this case, you can cut that check right away or use a debit card or some other form out of your checkbook LLC and take care of the problem. Also, by doing this, you can reduce your fees and that would otherwise be charged by your administrator. Next slide. There are some disadvantages of an LLC. First of all, you are setting up a business. You are setting up a business that's regulated by the state. And in that case, you have to pay the setup costs and the fees. You're going to have to pay usually some sort of an annual cost and fee for managing it. And there will be a requirement. For example, California charges $800 a year for that. And then every 2 years, you have to submit a form to the state of California and pay another $20. Some other states like Nevada have an annual requirement to pay $125 to submit the same form, by the way. You still need to pay attention. You have to keep good records. You have to pay attention to this as a business. And you must comply with state requirements for making sure you have an address, an agent for service of process on file with the Secretary of State. If you do not comply, if you fail to comply with these formalities, you could run the risk of having penalties. Your corporation, or your limited liability could be suspended for failure to pay the taxes. So you need to pay attention to these things. But again, they're not that difficult, but there are things you have to pay attention to. Next slide. Now, there's some unique applications. I'll go over mentioned a couple already, but I want to review them again. Using the checkbook LLC that is funded with one or more self-directed IRA accounts. I've mentioned foreclosure sales. Bulk REOs, where you have multiple transactions, is another good application of using the LLC. I've mentioned making private loans. Let me pause and talk about that for a moment. Let's say that you have a good friend that's flipping real estate as an investor, and they're going out and buying properties and flipping them. They need cash, and they need cash on a rotating basis and a fairly short-term basis. They may need a loan for, let's say, $150,000 to pay for the repairs. Well, if it's somebody you know and trust and are willing to do business with, you can write them a check. They can borrow the money from you, and you can take back a note, a deed of trust as security, and it's as good a loan as anything else, and you can make 10%, 12%, whatever you want to charge. Very clean, very easy to do, and there's no hassle. You don't have to do appraisals. You don't have to go through underwriters. You yourself can set yourself up and earn a nice 10 or 12% on your money. I know a lot of people using their IRAs are doing this, and that's certainly a better return than they're getting out of the stock market. If you have to close something fast, or you need to fund something fast, the checkbook LLC is ready to go. You can do this Saturday morning or Sunday night or on a holiday. Whatever you need to do, you have access to it. And as I mentioned, you can combine multiple IRAs, and you can combine IRAs and cash. Very important, though, all of that funding has to happen at the same time at the beginning when you set up the LLC. Next slide, please. Some of the disadvantages of the checkbook LLC are the same as some of the disadvantages of using a self-directed IRA. And first of all, is you have to be careful about not getting involved in any prohibited transaction. Even though the funds are set up in that LLC, the rules that govern the pension plan and the prohibited transactions still apply. Therefore, you have to be careful to manage your LLC properly, make sure you're doing it correctly, and of course the disadvantages is that there are setup costs and there are some annual fees that you have to pay. But you can pay these out of your IRA investment. Next slide, please. Now, how do you set up the IRA LLC? First, as I've said before, you have to have a self-directed IRA account. You have to get that up. That's always step one, is to make sure you have your IRA account. If your funds are still in some other 401k at one of these companies like Fidelity or Schwab or AG Edwards, you're going to have to get those funds over into the custodian or administrator. Now, you can do this at the same time you're setting up the LLC, but you have to have those funds there before you can spend them. All right? Make sure, this is very important, when you're picking a company to use for your CheckBook LLC, make sure that that self-directed IRA custodian will allow you to use the CheckBook LLC. There are a couple of companies that do not like to use the CheckBook LLC, and so make sure that they will allow you to set up a CheckBook LLC before you roll your funds over. Make sure you talk to a professional who is knowledgeable about IRA LLCs. Again, these are a different kind of limited liability company. They have some different rules. Do not, whatever you do, go on the internet and try to print out a template or some other standardized form of an operating agreement, and don't go to one of these companies on the internet that will set up an LLC for you for only a few dollars. They will create a problem for you because they're not properly set up to comply with the rules that govern the self-directed IRA. Next slide. When you're setting up the LLC, again, like anything else, make sure you keep in mind you're setting up a new business. You're going to have to research the name. You cannot use a name that is deceptively similar to any other name that has already been picked. So you have to give some thought. And I always ask my clients to send me their top 3 names that they want in order of preference, and I get the first one that we can grab. You have to reserve that name with the Secretary of State's office, and then register the LLC with the Secretary of State's office with the name that you've reserved. If you don't bother doing that, if you just send in the forms without having reserved the name, they may reject it. And if you're trying to get going with this property that you want to invest in, you don't want to have any delays. You must also obtain an employer identification number from the federal government, from the IRS, for your LLC. And when you walk down to the bank to open up your checking account, you're going to need your certified copies of your articles of organization and your EIN number. That's the process. Pretty straightforward, but there are quite a few little steps in there you got to make sure are done properly. Next slide. Now, once you have established the basic forms and documents, you'll have the following items. You'll have the articles of organization, which is registered with the Secretary of State's office. That's what SOS means. You'll have an operating agreement. Again, it has to be a specially formatted operating agreement, not one that you got off the internet. You'll have an employee identification number, or EIN. SS4 is the IRS form that you use to get one of those. You'll have a checking account, and it's like any other business checking account, and it'll be in the name of your limited liability company. You then will also have to file what's known as a statement of information, and this tells the Secretary of State's office is who's in charge, who's the manager, what's the address, and every 2 years you're going to have to pay $20 and submit that form and update it. And you'll have to remember that in California, every year you have to pay the Franchise Tax Board $800 for the pleasure of doing business in California. Next slide. Now, how can we avoid some of the potential problems that might come up in the course of using a CheckBook LLC? Remember, one of the things you have to be careful about is you must use the IRA funds to pay for all of your investment costs and expenses. You cannot put personal money into the deal after you've started the transaction. So, for example, if you have an emergency repair, if you have to do something, you cannot write a personal check to cover these things. The money must come from your IRA. So, rule one, plan ahead. Plan for contingencies and emergencies. Keep a little reserve of funds in there. When you're getting started, you leave a little contingency fund in there. And then, of course, if you're getting, hopefully, rental income from your property, you'll build up a little bit more of that contingency fund. And after a while, you may be able to do it. You may own 2 or 3 properties inside the LLC. And, the income from one can help offset the costs on another. Treat it as a legal business, again, not as a hobby. Pay attention to it. And, again, when you're doing your investments, as with all things, consult with professionals, not just your best friend forever. Next slide. Now, there's some other considerations to briefly consider, and one is everybody wants to think that they can get a better deal or get away from the $800 state taxes by opening an LLC in another state. And the rule is that the LLC must be registered in the state where you're doing business. And if you go and get an LLC in Nevada or Wyoming or Delaware or somewhere else, it's perfectly legal to do so. However, if you end up at any point buying property in California, which is, got a lot of good deals going on, but still much more expensive than other states, you'll end up having to pay the $800 in California anyway. But oftentimes what happens if you're investing out of state where the price points are much lower and much more profitable than California, I still strongly advise you start with a California LLC. And then you register that LLC in those states where you're doing business. It's less expensive in some cases than starting your own LLC in those states. How much money to put in to your fund? Well, you have to plan ahead and look at your costs and allow for contingencies. So, for example, if you've got a maximum of $200,000 in your IRA that you can put into the LLC, you should be targeting a purchase price that allows for anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 excess to cover closing costs and contingencies and any emergency repairs. Can you combine personal and IRA funds? Yes, but it's, again, you're opening yourself to the potential for problems if you don't keep absolutely perfect records. How many LLCs can you have? As many as you want. I'll make a quick note about series LLCs. Some people will hear about those. If you set up a series LLC, it's where you have one LLC with a number of subsets to them. The state of California considers each one of them to be a separate LLC for purposes of charging you the $800. And what are the cost trade-offs of an LLC? Well, again, the self-directed IRA allows you to invest your IRA money into a real estate investment. And there are some cost trade-offs. If you're only going to hold one investment and it's just that one transaction you're going to do, you can run it through your custodian or your administrator. The cost of setting up the LLC may be not worth it, and you need to stop and think about that. In other cases, you have to weigh the advantages versus the disadvantages. Some of the cost trade-offs, the $800 per year, for example, may be more expensive right now for you, and you may want to hold off and see at this time. It depends. Other times, again, if your goal is to use it for fast transactions, then that's a trade-off. Next slide, please. I want to make it absolutely clear that using the self-directed IRA has a number of tax advantages. There's many benefits to doing it this way, and using the CheckBook control gives you that added degree of control over your self-directed IRA. But it is still required that you do your fundamentals regarding due diligence. Like any other investment, you want to make sure that you've evaluated the risk of that investment and that you manage it. You remember, you can never eliminate the risk. Part of the deal with risk is that taking a risk is a way of making money on an investment, but you need to manage that risk, and doing so requires that you do your due diligence. Next slide, please. Remember, the self-directed IRA does not guarantee a return on investment. Now, of course, when you put your money in the stock market, you're not guaranteeing an investment return either. But when you're doing real estate, there are added elements of risk involved with that. Be sure you take those into account. And remember, Bernie Madoff was not the only scofflaw out there. There are lots of people selling snake oil and bad deals, and you got to make sure that you check with a professional. And it's always a good idea to have your investment reviewed by an attorney before you get involved in the transaction. I can't tell you the number of times the clients come to me and said, gee, I wish I had paid you to review this transaction before I got sent off the check, before I got involved in it. It's always more expensive to try to fix the problem after the fact. And remember, purchasing real estate using your IRA does not change other forces of life. For example, all of the normal risks of real estate investing apply. Fire, wind, vandalism, and as we saw over the last 4 years, a decline in value, vacancies, and need to do proper maintenance. These are all part of real estate investing. You need to understand those risks and be willing to take them. It's just the funding source of using your IRA gives you an advantage where you may not have the cash. Next slide, please. I want to just briefly mention, if I could, in the closing moments here, I have what I call the key elements of safe and sane asset protection. I mentioned earlier that having your money in a self-directed IRA is a form of asset protection, and it is. Generally, if you get sued for something, you get in a car accident and someone is badly injured, or you get into a business transaction not related to your IRA where somebody sues you, they cannot touch the money that's in your pension plan. Pension plans are generally protected from those types of situations. So what does the LLC give you? Well, one of the things the LLC gives you is an added layer of asset protection. By keeping your assets inside an LLC, again, you're protected from attacks from the outside. And if you own an investment property and one of your tenants is injured on the property, the maximum that they can go after is the value of the assets held inside the LLC. And they can't reach through the LLC and go after your personal assets. But there are two primary points of asset protection that I want to emphasize. The first is having competent property management. Having a good property manager to take care and prevent problems is a key way to prevent problems from happening in the first place. Second, having adequate insurance coverage. Just because you have an LLC doesn't say you don't need insurance. You should always have adequate insurance to cover the circumstances. Keep in mind that 99% of all lawsuits settle before they get to trial. And so that's a fact. Over 99% of all cases will settle before they go to the jury. So having an insurance company there with the policy, they will usually step in and defend some sort of a settlement along the way in most cases. Always consult with your tax and legal professionals before you get involved in any transaction. I know people want to say, well, why should we pay for a lawyer at the early stages rather than later? Why should I go to my tax consultant until I have some money to do? Well, I know personally as a lawyer, I've seen a lot of bad transactions as well as some good ones. So if you bring me one, I'll take a look at it. I may be able to keep you from getting into a bad transaction. Next slide, please. Okay, the wrap up. Self-directed IRA allows you a wide range of investment opportunities. The CheckBook LLC allows you to greater control over the process, but it requires that you pay some costs, and there are some special requirements. So there are advantages and disadvantages of the CheckBook LLC. You must consider how the IRA restrictions may impact your investment goals. Remember, if your goal is to make money and build wealth, you can purchase real estate. But if that real estate is property that is owned by your mother, or you're trying to buy property for your son, and that's part of your goal, it sounds good, but you cannot do it with your IRA. You must find other sources of funding for those types of investments. At this point, I normally just wrap it up, and we will just simply say to make sure you evaluate the pros and cons. I want you to make sure you use a reputable IRA custodian. Make sure also you do your due diligence with any real estate investing, regardless of where you're getting the money. And I thank you very much. Again, my name is Jeffrey Hare, and if you have the slide in front of you, you can reach me at jeff@jeffreyhare.com. My website at www.jeffreyhare.com. I usually try to post some relevant information for real estate investors. Feel free to go there and read those articles. And I thank you very much for paying your attention to this program. And thank you, Seewing, for letting me be your guest speaker for today.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Very powerful information. Sorry we're running out of time. And if you guys, I'm sure many of you that are listening have a lot of questions. Feel free to email Jeff. And his email is right on the slide. And you can also contact him. Of course, you can also contact me. And I do my best to answer your questions, although I'm not an attorney or a tax advisor. Of course, my dream team of advisors are here to help you by being part of my real estate community, the Yee Real Estate Network. You have tremendous access to great information. We're here to help you to achieve wealth. And thank you, Jeff, so much. You're part of my dream team, and looking forward to working with you and for the future. And thank you for taking your time out of your day to provide this outstanding value information. Thank you so much for attending, and have a good day, and talk to you guys later. Thank you.